something a little different today.
Different is good. I'm all ears.
We're talking about death.
The ultimate mystery.
Well, not exactly the what happens after you die kind of mystery.
Okay, so we're not wading into the philosophical deep end today.
Not today. This time, it's about the actual physical changes that happen to the human body. Post-mortem, all that sciencey stuff.
The science of death. Count me in. I've always found it fascinating.
You and me both. It's a bit macabre, sure, but there's so much we can learn from it. And judging by the sheer volume of crime dramas out there, people are fascinated. Which makes sense, right? It's a fundamental part of life. Well, the end of life, I guess.
And understanding how the body decomposes is crucial for forensic investigators. It can help determine the time of death, identify the deceased, and even reveal clues about the circumstances surrounding their death.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, we're turning to a true classic in the field, Knight's Forensic Pathology. Ever come across this one?
Oh, absolutely. It's a cornerstone text, kind of like the forensic pathologist's Bible.
So before we get into the nitty-gritty, what are some of the key mysteries we're going to untangle today?
Well, I think we should start by tackling those classic signs of death that everyone's curious about. The discoloration, the stiffening, all those post-mortem changes we see in movies and TV shows.
Right, like what's the deal with dead bodies turning blue? I think we've all wondered about that at some point.
But that's hypostasis at work. We'll break down the science behind it.
Perfect. And what about that whole stiffening thing? Rigor mortis, right?
Precisely. We'll delve into the fascinating chemistry behind rigor mortis and why it's not always as reliable a clue as crime dramas make it seem.
It's never as easy as they make it look on TV, is it?
Never. Which is what makes it so interesting. But before we get to all that, I think it's important to start with a seemingly simple question. What actually is death? I mean, how do we define it? Because it's not as cut and dry as you might think.
You're right. It's not just a case of lights out. There's a whole biological process involved, right?
Exactly. We often hear terms like somatic death and cellular death, but they describe different things. Somatic death is like flipping a switch. It's the moment the body as a whole shuts down, no more heartbeat, no breathing, no brain activity, the big picture stuff.
And cellular death is more of a gradual dimming of the lights.
An excellent analogy. It's the process of individual cells dying off, and different types of cells and tissues die at different rates.
So even after the heart stops beating and someone is declared dead, there are still parts of the body where the cells are clinging on.
Absolutely. And that has huge implications for things like, say, organ donation. The brain, for example, is very vulnerable to a lack of oxygen. Just a few minutes without it, and the damage can be irreversible. On the other hand, tissues like skin and bone can actually survive for much longer periods, even after somatic death.
So it's a race against time, really.
In a way, yes. Different tissues are on different clocks, which is what makes organ donation even more incredible when you think about it. A delicate dance between life and death at a cellular level.
It's amazing what medical science can accomplish. And it's this whole concept of cellular death that underpins those legal distinctions between, say, someone being declared brain dead versus, their heart stopping.
You've got it. It's far more nuanced than we often realize.
Okay, so we've established that death is a process, not just a moment in time.
Precisely. And it's a process that leaves behind a fascinating trail of clues that forensic investigators can use to piece together the story of what happened.
Which brings us back to those intriguing and, let's be honest, slightly gruesome post-mortem changes, like that whole turning blue thing. Ready to break that down?
Absolutely. Let's talk hypostasis. So hypostasis, or livor mortis as it's sometimes called, it's all about gravity.
Gravity.
Yeah.
So it's like, what, the Grim Reaper's version of an apple falling from a tree?
In a way. You see, when the heart stops pumping, the blood isn't circulating anymore. And blood is heavier than other fluids in the body, so it naturally starts to pool in the lowest parts of the body.
Okay, so it's like leaving a snow globe unshaken for a while. All the glitter eventually settles at the bottom.
Exactly. And this pooling of blood, it shows up as that reddish blue, sometimes even purplish discoloration that we see in,
Dead bodies, let's just say it.
Right, of course. And the pattern of this discoloration can be surprisingly revealing for forensic investigators.
Revealing how? Tell me more.
Well, imagine a body lying on its back. The hypostasis is that blood pooling. It'll be most prominent on the back, the buttocks, the backs of the legs, those areas that are closest to the ground. But here's where it gets interesting. Let's say, for whatever reason, the body is moved after death, say, flipped onto its stomach.
The blood's not going to magically unpool, is it?
Exactly. The original pattern of hypostasis is essentially fixed.
So it's like a hidden map that tells investigators if a body's been moved, even if there are no other signs.
Precisely. And it gets even more intriguing. The color of hypostasis, that can hold clues too,
Wait, there are different shades of dead body blue.
in a manner of speaking. For instance, if the hypostasis has a cherry pink hue, that could indicate carbon monoxide poisoning.
Really? Wow, that's incredible. So even those subtle variations in color can be significant. So I guess that means if an investigator sees cherry pink hypostasis, it's a slam dunk case of carbon monoxide poisoning, right?
Well, not quite. Forensic science is rarely that simple. It's about context, you see. Numerous things can influence the color of hypostasis, like the surrounding temperature, the deceased's medical history, even things like how long they were in a particular position. It's never just one clue in isolation.
So it's like a puzzle, and hypothesis is just one piece, albeit a very telling one.
Exactly. It all feeds into building a bigger picture.
This is making me realize how much I've been taking for granted watching those crime dramas all these years. I need to start paying more attention.
We've all been there.
Okay, so we've covered hypothesis. Now on to that other classic sign of death we see everywhere, rigor mortis. What causes a body to stiffen up like that after death?
Ugh. Rigor mortis. The classic image of a stiff, lifeless body. It all comes down to muscle chemistry. You see, for our muscles to relax, to go about their normal business of contracting and releasing, they need energy. And that energy is supplied by a molecule called ATP adenosine triphosphate.
ATP, got it. And what happens to ATP after death?
Well, when death occurs, ATP production, it stops. Without that crucial energy source, the muscle fibers, they get stuck. They lock up in a contracted state, and that's what causes the stiffness of rigor mortis.
So it's basically like the muscles have run out of gas, leaving them frozen in place.
A very apt analogy. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting. Just like a stage play, the timing and the intensity of rigor mortis can be quite dramatic.
Dramatic. Tell me more about this muscle drama.
Well, just like a good play needs the right setting and actors, rigor mortis is influenced by a whole host of factors. Temperature, for instance, is a major one. Heat, as you know, it speeds up chemical reactions. So in a hot environment, rigor mortis, it sets in much faster.
Makes sense. Heat speeds things up, cold slows things down. It's like how food spoils faster left out on the counter than in the fridge.
Precisely. On the flip side, in colder temperatures, rigor mortis is delayed. And just like a dramatic climax in a play, extreme physical exertion before death, that can also accelerate rigor mortis.
So someone who dies in the middle of, say, running a marathon, they might stiffen up faster than someone who dies peacefully in their sleep.
Exactly. Think about those stories of soldiers found frozen in battle poses. If they died in a moment of intense action, their rigor mortis could have set in quickly, preserving their final stance.
That's incredible. So contrary to what we might see in the movies, where rigor mortis seems to slowly creep in, it can actually be quite a rapid process. It all depends on the circumstances.
Exactly. Every death scene is unique, just like a play.
This is also fascinating. So I imagine rigor mortis is a pretty reliable way for investigators to determine the exact time of death, right? Like they just check how stiff the body is and bam, case closed.
If only it were that simple. While rigor mortis can sometimes give investigators a general idea, for example, if the body is still warm or cold to the touch, it's not a very precise clock.
So no rigor mortis app on their fancy forensic tablets that tells them exactly when the clock stopped ticking.
I'm afraid not. There are just too many variables at play. But don't worry, that doesn't mean the investigation hits a dead end. It just means it's time to look for other clues. Which brings us to decomposition.
Ah, yes, decomposition. The less glamorous side of the post-mortem changes. But I have a feeling you're going to tell me it's just as fascinating as the rest.
Oh, absolutely. It may not be the most pleasant topic for dinner conversation, but it is a vital part of nature's cycle.
And judging by this chapter title, Decomposition, Nature's Recycling Program, it sounds like we're about to get into some, shall we say, lively details.
Let's just say it's a process that involves a lot of dot actors. And it all starts with the gut.
The gut, as in our gut bacteria.
Precisely. Those trillions of microbes that live in our intestines, they're essential for digestion while we're alive, but after death, well, they don't stop working just because we do.
So our own gut bacteria, our tiny little helpers, they kind of turn against us in the end.
In a way, yes. See, when we're alive, our immune system, it keeps those bacteria in check. But after death, the immune system, it's off duty. Which means those bacteria, they're free to start breaking down tissues, releasing gases, all those things that contribute to the less appealing aspects of decomposition.
Like bloating, discoloration, and, if memory serves, A rather unpleasant odor.
You've got it. And it's not just our own internal bacteria. Microbes from the environment, they can get in on the action too, which can speed up the process even more.
So once we die, we're basically an all-you-can-eat buffet for microorganisms.
Essentially, yes.
Charming. So walk us through the stages of this dirt recycling program. What exactly happens as decomposition progresses?
Well, the most common form of decomposition is putrefaction, which is basically the breakdown of tissues by bacteria.
Okay, putrefaction, got it.
I
What are
know.
the telltale signs?
Well, the skin undergoes a pretty dramatic transformation. It starts out pale, but then as those bacteria get to work, it takes on a greenish hue, eventually turning almost black. Skin slippage, where the outer layers start to detach, is also common. And then there's the smell.
Which, as you so delicately put it earlier, will leave to the imagination.
Probably for the best.
Now, we can't talk about decomposition without addressing the dot element, or rather the maggot, in the room.
Ah, yes, maggots. They tend to evoke a visceral reaction in people, but they actually play a vital role in the decomposition process.
I'm guessing it's not a role that involves tiny little violins.
Not quite. Maggots, you see, are nature's cleanup crew. They feed on the decomposing tissues, and in doing so, they actually help to break down the body and recycle those nutrients back into the ecosystem.
So it's a gruesome job, but somebody's got to do it, right?
Precisely. And here's a fascinating tidbit. Forensic entomologists, those are scientists who specialize in insects, they can actually use the presence of maggots to estimate the time of death.
Wait, really? How does that work? Are there different types of maggots for different stages of decomposition?
In a way, yes. Different species of flies are attracted to bodies at different stages of decomposition. And each species of fly, it has a very specific life cycle. Egg, larva, pupa, adult. By studying the types of insects present on a body and their stage of development, forensic entomologists can get a surprisingly accurate estimate of how long the body has been there.
So it's like a tiny little insect clock. That's incredible. But I'm guessing, like everything else we've talked about, it's not always that straightforward.
You're right, like everything else, context is key. Temperature, humidity, even things like whether the body was exposed to sunlight can all impact insect activity.
Right, because flies aren't exactly known for their punctuality.
Exactly. So while forensic entomology can be a powerful tool, it's not an exact science. It's another piece of the puzzle.
Another myth of forensic science busted. So we've talked about how the body itself changes after death, but I imagine the environment plays a role in decomposition too, right?
Absolutely. The environment can have a huge impact. For instance, did you know that bodies actually decompose slower in water than in air?
Really? I always thought it was the opposite. Why is that?
It seems counterintuitive, but the cooler temperatures in water and the reduced exposure to certain insects, it actually slows down the decomposition process. It's like hitting the pause button to some extent.
Interesting. So being submerged in water is like nature's way of preserving a body.
Well, preserve might be a bit of a stretch. Water introduces its own set of changes, but it does significantly slow down the decomposition process compared to, say, a body left out in the open air.
So another crime drama trope bites the dust. I'm starting to think those shows play fast and loose with the science.
Let's just say they take some creative liberties. But speaking of environments, what about burial?
Good point. I mean, a body buried 6 feet under isn't exactly exposed to the elements in the same way as one left out in the open.
Exactly. And there's a common misconception that buried bodies decompose quickly, turning to skeletons in a matter of months. In reality, burial can actually slow down decomposition quite a bit. The cooler and more stable temperatures underground, the lack of oxygen, the absence of insects, all of these factors contribute to a slower breakdown process.
So those old stories about perfectly preserved bodies being unearthed centuries later, not entirely far-fetched.
Not entirely. It all depends on the specific conditions. Take something called adipocere, for instance.
Adipocere. Now, there's a word I haven't heard before. What in the world is adipocere?
It's not the most appetizing topic, I'll grant you that. Basically, adipocere is this waxy, grayish white substance that forms from body fat in certain conditions.
Body fat turning into wax. That's
Yeah.
different. How does that happen?
It all comes down to chemistry. Under certain conditions, like in wet environments or environments with a specific pH, the normal process of decomposition is disrupted. And when the breakdown of fat outpaces the breakdown of other tissues, you get adipocere formation.
And this adipocere It's pretty durable stuff, right?
Incredibly. It's actually remarkably resistant to decomposition. That's why you sometimes hear about bodies being exhumed years, even centuries later, and they're still relatively well preserved, encased in this waxy substance, like nature's own death mask.
That's both amazing and slightly creepy. It's like nature hit the pause button on decomposition, preserving a snapshot in time.
You could say that. And here's another interesting thing about adipocere. Because it's so durable, it can actually help to preserve injuries on a body.
So even if a body's been encased in adipocere for years, investigators could still potentially determine if there were any bullet wounds, stab wounds, that kind of thing.
Exactly. It's like a hidden chapter in the story of a person's death, just waiting to be uncovered.
Hmm.
And adipocere isn't the only curveball nature throws our way. There's also mummification.
Mummification. Now that's something we usually associate with ancient Egypt, those elaborate tombs and rituals.
Right. But mummification itself, it's not about rituals or fancy tombs. It's all about the environment. Dryness, that's the key.
Dryness. How so?
Well, dryness, it basically halts the usual decomposition process.
Yeah.
Most of the bacteria that break down our tissues, they need moisture to survive. So
Yeah.
in a really dry environment, those bacteria, they can't do their thing. It's like putting the brakes on decomposition, which is why you find naturally mummified bodies in places you might not expect. Like where? Give me some examples.
Attics, for instance. Basements, if they're particularly dry.
Yeah.
Deserts, obviously. I even read about a case where a body was found mummified in a hayloft.
A hayloft. Talk about the last place you'd expect to stumble upon a mummy. So it's like a creepy, accidental time capsule. And these naturally mummified bodies, they can stick around for a long time, right?
Oh, absolutely. We're talking centuries even. And
Mhm.
just like with adipocere, mummified remains, they can provide incredible insights for forensic investigators, even after all this time.
It's amazing to think that a body could hold on to clues for that long, silently waiting to tell its story. Okay, so I've got bodies turning blue, stiffening up, bloating, liquefying, turning to wax, drying out. Is there anything else nature might throw at us in this macabre game of decomposition roulette?
Well, we haven't even touched on scavengers. Ah, right. Because it's not just insects and microbes that have a taste for .us.
Exactly. Depending on where a body is found, animals, rats, foxes, even dogs in some cases, they might contribute to the decomposition process, scattering remains, accelerating the breakdown of tissues. And if a body ends up in the water, well, then you've got a whole other cast of characters in the form of aquatic creatures.
Let's just say I'm feeling very grateful for the controlled environment of a mortuary right about now. Okay, so with all these factors at play, these different pathways of decomposition, these scavengers lurking about, how in the world do forensic pathologists even begin to figure out when someone died? It seems like an impossible task.
It's definitely a challenge, there's no doubt about that. Especially when you're dealing with bodies that have been exposed to the elements or have undergone significant decomposition. But even in those cases, there are clues to be found. It just requires a keen eye, a solid understanding of the science, and a bit of good old-fashioned detective work.
So no magic time of death button on their fancy forensic gadgets?
Afraid not.
Darn. I was hoping for a peek behind the technological curtain there.
The reality is much more nuanced. Take one of the most common methods for estimating the time of death, measuring body cooling.
Okay, that makes sense. A warm body, probably more recently deceased than a cold one, right?
Yes, precisely. But here's the thing. The rate at which a body cools after death, it's not as straightforward as you might think. It's affected by a whole bunch of things.
Like,
Well, body size, for one. A larger person, they're going to cool down more slowly than a smaller person, just like a larger pot of water takes longer to cool than a smaller one.
makes sense.
What else? The amount of clothing the person was wearing also comes into play. A heavily clothed body, it's going to retain heat longer than a naked body. And of course, we can't forget about the environment. A body found outdoors on a freezing cold day, it's going to cool much faster than a body found indoors in a heated room.
So it's not as simple as just sticking a thermometer in and calling it a day.
You got it.
Yeah.
It's a lot more complicated than that. For instance, did you know that a body doesn't actually cool down at a uniform rate? The core temperature, which is usually measured...
Let's just say internally for our listeners who are enjoying their morning coffee.
Right, of course. Well, the core body temperature, it actually stays stable for a while after death, before it starts to cool. We call this the plateau phase.
So it's like a delayed reaction before the cooling really kicks in.
Exactly. And the length of this plateau phase, it can vary, which makes it tricky to use body temperature alone to pinpoint the exact time of death. It's a piece of the puzzle, but not the whole picture.
Okay, so if body cooling isn't a foolproof method, What other techniques do forensic pathologists have in their arsenal? What about analyzing stomach contents? Is that helpful?
It can be in some cases, but like everything else, it's not always clear-cut. The rate at which food is digested it varies depending on what was eaten, how much was eaten, individual metabolism, even things like stress levels.
So you can't necessarily look at a half-digested burger in someone's stomach and say, okay, they ate this 2 hours before they died.
Not quite. There are just too many factors that could influence the rate of digestion.
Okay, what about the eyes? There's that whole eyes are the window to the soul thing. Do the eyes hold any clues even after death?
Interestingly enough, they do. The fluid inside the eye, called the vitreous humor, it can be analyzed for chemical changes that occur after death, specifically the level of potassium.
And what does potassium tell us?
Well, the potassium level in the vitreous humor, it rises in a fairly predictable way after death. So, by measuring the potassium level, forensic pathologists can get some idea of how long ago death occurred.
So the eyes really are a window into the post-mortem timeline. Who knew?
To an extent, yes. But again, it's not a perfect method. Like most things in forensic science, it's an estimate.
Right. It's not like those crime shows where they have all the fancy gadgets and they can tell you the exact time of death down to the minute.
Exactly. The truth is, determining the time of death, it's often more of an art than a science. It's about taking all of these pieces of evidence, the body temperature, the rigor mortis, the stage of decomposition, the insect activity, the stomach contents, the vitreous potassium, and putting them all together to form a conclusion.
A conclusion that might not always be perfectly clear or precise.
Precisely. Even with all the tools and techniques at our disposal, there's always going to be some degree of uncertainty when it comes to pinpointing the exact moment of death.
Which I guess just goes to show you that even in death, there are still mysteries to be unraveled.
Absolutely. The science of death, it's a constantly evolving field. There's always something new to learn, new techniques to explore, and I have a feeling we've only just scratched the surface today.
Well, you've certainly given our listeners a lot to ponder, that's for sure. It's amazing how much information can be gleaned from these post-mortem changes, these silent transformations that occur after the curtain falls. And on that somewhat morbid note,
Perhaps we should save the rest of our decomposition discussion for another time.
probably a good call. To our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the mysteries of death dissected. Until next time, stay curious.